Hi, welcome to Constitutional Chats, hosted by me, Janine Turner,
and Kathy Gillespie,
with students
Dakari Chapman
and me, Tova Kaplan.
Join us as we discuss hot topic issues with constitutional experts. It's sponsored by Constituting America.
I'm Janine Turner, founder and co-president of Constituting America, and welcome to Constitutional Chats. We're thrilled that you're with us today and your panel of co-hosts, Kathy Gillespie and Aubrey, and we have Jewel and Jorn Gilbert, and we're just thrilled that you're with us. So come on in, we're asking you to sign in and let us know if you're a middle school student, a high school student, college student, fan, friend, family, just so we know the best way to tailor our speech today, or shall we say our discussion, which is Benjamin Rush today, the little known signer of the Declaration, even though you've probably heard his name, Benjamin Rush. Last week was George Ross. I think he was less familiar, but Benjamin Rush is our topic today, and our special constitutional expert is Mr. William J Federer, and we're thrilled that he's here with us. Okay, I'm going to introduce him in just a minute, but first I'm going to talk about Aubrey, who is our director of media and is responsible for all of our fabulous technology. She's also one of the most brilliant winners of our We the Future College STEM winner. She won our We the Future contest. She's born and raised in Utah, and she's the middle of 7 children. I won't sing Sound of Music to you today. She's a student at Brigham Young University and aspires to be an athletic coach, which she'll be a great coach because she has a wonderful energy, which you'll see in just a minute. And she just lights up the screen with her smile, and she's going to inspire greatness in her athletes. Hello, Aubrey. Tell us our statistics today, please.
Hi, Janine. Thank you. It's always fun to be here. So the largest group that we have today with us is 24% of parent and grandparents with children. And then we have another 24% of fans, 21% of friends. And then we have 9% family, 9% donors, 9% teachers. And then we also have 3% elementary school students and another 3% of middle and high school students. So we're so glad that all of you are here today.
We are. Thank you, Aubrey. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. All right, you ready to get down to the show? First, I'm going to introduce everybody. Kathy is co-president of Constituting America. And I always like to say, I just, in order to get anything off the ground, it takes a right wing or a left wing to fly. And without Kathy, I'd just be flapping around on the ground, hoping to get off the ground. But also, the wind beneath our wings are you, our donor and donors. And so Kathy's going to introduce our special donor of today and say hello to Kathy. Kathy, just say she was on the Hill, a chief of staff on the Hill. I think we have a photo of her, a chief of staff on the Hill for years, decades and decades, who just ran the tightest ship in the shipping industry up there. And she's also was the commissioner of the White House Fellows, the president of the White House Fellows. And she's now one of the esteemed 17 citizens out of all of America who've been picked to be on the prestigious Semi-Quincentennial Commission. So Kathy, say hello.
Hi, Janine, and thank you. You give the best introductions, and one of my greatest joys is getting to work with you with Constituting America every day. Thank you for all you do, and thank you for your leadership. I want to thank our.
No one said, because there we go. Now we can see it. Your picture was still up. Thank you, Kathy. Okay, go ahead.
I want to thank our very generous donor who is our sponsor today. He wanted to remain anonymous, but he is a Mayo Clinic trained doctor in West Virginia. And as I learn more and more about Benjamin Rush, I feel like that our sponsor today is a modern day Benjamin Rush. He is a true patriot, and he contributes to to preserving our country's history in so many ways. And he's such a great supporter and encourager of constituting America. And so we thank you from the bottom of our hearts to our very generous doctor sponsor in West Virginia for sponsoring today's episode.
We'll just call him Dr. Anonymous. How's that? Thank you, Dr. Anonymous. I know who you are. Thank you very much.
Recording in progress.
Oh, recordings in progress because Tova just joined us. The oh so brilliant Tova, just in time for your introduction. Tova's only 17, but we've known her since she was 13. And when she was 13, she spoke more intelligently than most 60-year-olds. She's just a true gem and an amazing, amazing, amazing young woman. She's won our contest 3 times. She's the National Youth Director of our Youth Council. And let's see, she won for Best PSA, Best STEM, and Best Entrepreneurial Marketing Plan. So there you go. And she just runs our national, as a national youth director, she runs our youth advisory board like a top CEO of a top 100 company. She speaks 3 languages, and she's passionate about the Constitution, which is just super, super terrific. And she is going to be, you're going to see her as the ambassador of the UN or as the president of the United States or secretary of state, whatever Tova wants to accomplish. Just see this face. You're going to see it more and more in the future. She's heading off to what you have is, you're only a junior, so you still have 1 more year before your parents have to let you go to college. I know it well. Tova, we can't hear you very well. You might need to shut down and start up again or something. Kind of sounded like you were speaking yet another foreign language from Mars. Okay, now Julian Jordan Gilbert. You go ahead and shut down, Tova, and come back on. I think that'll take care of it, hopefully. Julian Jordan Gilbert are new to our show. Gosh, this is maybe your 7th or 8th show. Extraordinary, brilliant young men that we are just honored to know. Jewel Gilbert is the executive producer, and Jordan Gilbert is operations director of Sing for America, a family-based company that the brothers co-founded. Sing for America seeks to show the art of truth and light through live performance. Both are proud, we are proud of them for being our former We the Future contest winners, both of them. Sing for America is an actor-run theater company which specializes in semi-professional musicals, private training in the arts, school drama solutions, and public entertainment events, all while revealing a colorblind world stage. Jewel and Jordan are graduates of Moravian College, where they each earned a BA in musical performance and dramatic production. And they're just truly, truly an asset to our show, an intellectual asset to our show. We're thrilled you're here. Welcome, Jewel and Jordan.
Hello, how's everybody today? Hope you're all doing well out there in Constitutional Chats world, as we're going to talk about a pretty cool subject. I don't know much about Benjamin Rush, but his name rolls off the tongue, so seems like he'll be a good character.
Yes, he will. Okay, we have a great expert to talk about that. I'm going to introduce Mr. William J. Federer, and I believe we have a photo of him. There you go. Mr. William J. Federer is a nationally known speaker, best-selling author, and president of AmeriSearch, Inc., a publishing company dedicated to researching America's noble heritage. Publishing company, that's cool. Bill's American Minute radio feature is broadcast daily across America and by the internet. His Faith and History television show airs on TCT Network on stations across America and via DirecTV. Bill is a former congressional candidate, has appeared on numerous television news programs, and is a sought-after public speaker. Bill's first book, America's God and Country Encyclopedia of Quotations, it's gotta be good, has sold over 500,000 copies. Publishers are happy. He is the author of 21 books, including his newest, and I really, 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 really want to read this one, Miraculous Milestones in Science, Medicine, and Innovation, and the Faith of Those Who Achieve Them. I'm always saying that the scientists that God is whispering in their ear. That sounds really like a wonderful book. Bill has gained national recognition for lecturing and writing, receiving an honorary doctorate of humanities from American Christian College in 2004, and an honorary doctorate of global leadership from Midwest University in 2013, as well as many other awards and accolades. I want to be an honorary doctorate somewhere. Anyway, Bill Federer, welcome to Constitutional Chats. We're thrilled you're here to teach us today about Benjamin Rush. And why don't you just start in, tell us all about him, and then we will pepper you with questions, and we will also listen to you, our audience. If you have a question, you can type it in, and Kathy will be the monitor of that toward the end of the show. So welcome.
Well, thank you, Janine, and Aubrey, and Kathy, and Jewel, and Jorn, and Tova, and all those that are watching. Benjamin Rush, he was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He's a doctor. He went to medical school in Edinburgh, Scotland, and then he started a medical clinic there in Philadelphia. He was anti-slavery. He was for women's education. Just a pioneer. He's considered one of the fathers of American medicine and the father of American psychiatry. And back then, when someone was not thinking straight, they would lock them up. If you saw the Disney version of Belle, the Beauty and the Beast, the father was going to be locked up. Remember that? In an insane asylum. But he said, well, rather than lock them up, let's study the medical conditions that they're in and treat them. And so he is considered the father of American psychiatry. One of the issues that brought him to the forefront was smallpox. And few people realize that during the Revolutionary War, more people died of smallpox than died in battle. And now I send out a little daily email called American Minute. And I have one of my pages that is specifically on Benjamin Rush. I don't know if I have the ability to share it or not, but some of the particular quotes that I have, here's one from John Adams. He says, "Disease has destroyed 10 men for us, where the sword of the enemy has killed one." That was John Adams writing to his wife, Abigail. So people aren't familiar with the aspects. When you get soldiers together in tight areas, then diseases can spread quickly. And there was, they called it camp fever. George Washington's wife, Martha, had a son from her previous marriage named Custis, and he died of camp fever. So it was George Washington's, would have been sort of adopted son, but he died of camp fever. And Washington, by the way, was immune to smallpox because when he was a teenager, he had gone with his older half-brother Lawrence to Barbados. The older half-brother had a medical condition that the doctors thought that climate would help him. It didn't. He eventually died. But while they were in Barbados, George Washington caught smallpox and almost died, but he recovered. And that was providential because during the Revolutionary War, he was able to travel throughout all the different infected troops and not be harmed. Canada would have been part of America had it not been for smallpox. Yes, we sent an army up there to Montreal and Quebec, but the soldiers got sick with smallpox. And there is quite a number of instances where the British, who had soldiers infected with smallpox, would leave them. So for not quite a year, the British had occupied Boston. And then Washington was able to put cannons on the high hill called Dorchester Heights. And the British realized that all their ships in the harbor were vulnerable, so they decided to evacuate. But they left all of their sick soldiers infected with smallpox in the city. And so when George Washington was there, he forbade his troops from meeting with anybody from Boston for fear that they would get smallpox. So Benjamin Rush was one of the first ones that introduced vaccinating the troops. And this was a new kind of concept. They would have some pox were like bumps that would be pussy and then dry into scabs. And so one of the methods they used was to take a razor and scrape a scab to make dust and then blow it up somebody's nose. And But another way they would vaccinate was they'd take a little thread and run it through somebody that had a pussy pox, and then make an incision on your arm and bury that thread in the incision and tie it back up and let you catch it that way. And so the weakened version of smallpox would, you would get sick, but you would recover, and then you would have immunity. And so Benjamin Rush was one of the pioneers in that. And so this was a very serious situation. There's stories where Abigail Adams would remind John Adams to smoke his letters before he sent them out of Boston. And you think, what does smoke a letter mean? They'd have a little box that they would put the letters in, and underneath they would have a little fire. It would fill that little box with smoke. And they thought that would be their version of sanitizing it so that the disease wouldn't somehow be carried with the letter and have smallpox spread. There were instances in like Milford, Connecticut, where the British sent a whole bunch of captured prisoners ashore. And everybody at first was happy, but then they realized all these prisoners that they had let go had been infected with smallpox. And so it caused that whole area to be locked down, so to speak. And it spread across the country and even wiped out Indian tribes, even went west and even all the way to British Columbia, and in some cases even to Alaska. So smallpox was dreaded. Where European genetic people had, they would catch smallpox, but not die in as large as numbers as Indians. Genetically, they didn't have the resistance, and so it would literally wipe out tribes. And so we had this situation of smallpox. They would turn churches into hospitals. They'd turn schools and homes into hospitals. Benjamin Rush would help take care of them. They had a question of inoculating or vaccinating the troops, but they didn't want the British to know about it, because for a week or two, the troops would be out of commission. And so George Washington was trying to figure out how to do this. Martha Washington got inoculated. And so this was sort of rudimentary by today's medical standards. But again, this is before Louis Pasteur and the discovery of germs and the invention of the microscope. And so, and even hand washing, that wasn't until the middle 1850s that they learned that hand washing would prevent the spread of diseases. Sort of a little bit gruesome, but doctors would show how hardworking they were by how much blood was on their apron. And they'd be working all day and cutting off arms and legs and so forth. And only after the Ignaz Semmelweis, who was a European doctor, and then in America is Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., that they advocated the washing of hands. And then, I wanted to highlight the part about, now some people might as well throw this in. Some people say, well, didn't some of those Europeans give blankets with smallpox to the Indians? There was only one instance of that recorded, and that was Amherst, where there was a Sir Geoffrey Amherst, and it was the British Fort Pitt, and the Indians during the French and Indian War had been wiping out these British forts. And one of the soldiers suggested this in a letter. And now whether it happened or not is still, there's debate over it, but that's the origin of that thought that's been repeated quite often. And Washington writes, quoted a letter from a General Sullivan, that the army is sickly, many with smallpox, and he is apprehensive the military ordered to join them will not escape the infection. And anyway, so we'll fast forward past that. Even Benjamin Rush inoculated Patrick Henry, who was the 5-time governor of Virginia, and to help so that he wouldn't get the smallpox. The story goes on with Benjamin Rush that he was in Philadelphia, and he is started a free medical clinic there. And I'll just pause real quick. In the book that I had up on the screen called Miraculous Milestones in Science, Medicine, and Innovation, I give a quick overview of hospitals and how they started with Christianity. You have the ancient Egyptians. They didn't have healthcare for the poor. Healthcare was only for the pharaoh, and the healthcare was putting manure and beetles on your sores. It wasn't really very helpful. India, their belief system of Hinduism was you don't help the poor. If they're poor, that's because they sinned in some past life. And if you care about them, you will let them suffer. So they'll be reincarnated in a higher state in the next life. So medical care for the poor did not originate in India, didn't originate in China. And it originated with Jesus, where he said, I was sick and you visited me. And they said, when, Lord, did we do this to you? And then he gave the story of the Good Samaritan, where a guy was beat up, left on the side of the road, and the Good Samaritan cleaned the wound out with wine and then put oil on as a type of antiseptic, and then took him to an inn and said, take care of him. And when I get back, I'll pay you more. And so this was the first instance of giving medical care to a complete stranger. I do want to highlight that actual medical care originated with the Hebrews, not Greece. Greek medical care originally was getting high on something and sleeping with snakes and letting them crawl over you, and you had a dream or some. But the Hebrews, when you examine the law, they had a dietary law. Don't eat pork. Well, pork, the pigs would be around all kinds of trash and they would get worms, and you would not get the worms if you didn't eat the pork. The Hebrews had, if you would, the sewage treatment, you would go out of the camp with a shovel and you would cover it. And then when somebody got a communicable disease, the Hebrew law says that they would be isolated for 40 days. And the Latin word for 40 is quarenta, which is where we get the word quarantine. So when we say, oh, somebody's sick with this disease that spreads, we need to quarantine them. Well, that word quarantine is 40, and that comes from the Hebrew law, where you would isolate someone for 40 days. Other things, where the law says you circumcise the baby boys on the 8th day. Well, it wasn't until fairly recently they discovered that vitamin K is needed for blood clotting, and it peaks on the 8th day. So it would clot very quickly when they would do the circumcision. And then there's stories or in the Hebrew law where they would take the ashes of a red heifer, a cow, and that had not had calves yet, and you would put it in a vessel and pour water through it. And then you would take the water that was poured through it and sprinkle the things that you wanted to purify. Well, lo and behold, what is ashes? It's activated carbon. And what are water filters today? They're activated carbon. And so lo and behold, the Hebrew law actually had scientifically verifiable things to help keep the children of God healthy. But as far as the medical care, the free for the poor, you had in that first 3 centuries of Christianity, people would make pilgrimages to the Holy Land and wind up there worn out. And so they would have a place for them to convalesce. And the Latin word for pilgrim or traveler was hosp, H-O-S-P. And so they would call these places hospitals for the travelers to convalesce. So the very concept of hospital started with Christians going on pilgrimage to the Middle East. Now, they would be attacked, especially when Islam began expanding. And so they needed a security system. So they were called Knights Hospitaller. And then there was a plague of Justinian in 541 AD, and 25 million people die. And there's a Saint Samson the Hospitable in Constantinople, and he doctors up the people, and the Justinian gives them a bunch of money. And then Western Europe, you have the Benedictine order, and they pioneer medical care. They have the first medical school in Western Europe. In Salerno, Italy, is the Benedictine order. And then there's a hotel in Paris, Hotel Dieu. The word hotel comes from that word hostel or traveler. And Dieu means God. And so this was the Hospital of God, started in 660 AD in Paris, and then staffed by nuns. And one of these, there was Muslim pirates on the Mediterranean, and they would capture people and enslave them. And so there were whole Catholic orders through the Middle Ages called the Trinitarians, and they would raise money at church and ransom back your friend who was captured. And one of those captured was Vincent de Paul, and he was a slave, and he witnessed to one of his master's wives, and she converted, and she began to tell her husband, and the husband finally let Vincent de Paul escape. And he goes back to Europe. And in 1607, around the same time the Pilgrims, or excuse me, the Virginia's being settled, Vincent de Paul starts a hospital. The Queen of France gives him a bunch of money, and it's staffed by the Sisters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul. They go on to have hundreds of hospitals in Europe. And then French Revolution chopped off a bunch of their heads, but then they began to come to America. First hospital in America was founded in 1755 in Philadelphia. Ben Franklin helped to finance it, and it mentions dedicated to God on the cornerstone. And Benjamin Rush worked there. So Benjamin Rush helped pioneer this medical care for the poor in Philadelphia. And he was a member of the Continental Congress, signed the Declaration of Independence. His wife, Julia, was the daughter of Richard Stockton, also a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and Thomas Paine. He wrote Common Sense. You may have been familiar with that. So it's the December of 1776, and George Washington, his army had only volunteered for 6 months, and they were about to leave and go home, and the war would have been over. And so Thomas Paine's Common Sense, called American Crises. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer patriot and the sunshine warrior will in times like this leave, and heaven knows how to place a value on its goods, and it's so valuable a price as freedom, makes that it would be highly rated. And I apologize for butchering that quote. But Thomas Paine had all of his writings reviewed by Benjamin Rush. And so Benjamin Rush had a part to play in Thomas Paine's writings, which inspired Washington's troops. So they didn't leave at the end of 6 months. They stayed, they won the Battle of Trenton and Princeton, and then we began to win battles after that. Again, another contribution of Benjamin Rush. He helped write Pennsylvania's Constitution, and as a member of the Pennsylvania State Convention, he helped ratify the U.S. Constitution. Benjamin Rush was the treasurer of the U.S. Mint, where they minted the coins. They didn't have paper currency yet. And he helped found Dickinson College to train physicians, and helped found the Philadelphia Dispensary. And there's a statue of Benjamin Rush on the campus grounds of Dickinson College. And so he was a pioneer, again, considered one of the fathers of American medicine. If you ever go to Philadelphia and go through the airport, you'll see a really nice display of the history of hospitals, but it all goes back to Philadelphia, and Benjamin Rush was a key part of that. In 1793, there was a yellow fever outbreak in Philadelphia, and Benjamin Rush recognized it was not contagious person to person. It later was discovered it was through mosquito bites, and he hated slavery. Benjamin Rush said that slavery was repugnant to the genius of Christianity, and he supported ending slavery by founding the Society for the Abolition of Slavery. He also started a Sunday School Union and a Philadelphia Bible Society. And perhaps one of Benjamin Rush's great contributions was he got Thomas Jefferson and John Adams to become friends again. And you think, what's that all about? Well, Jefferson and Adams worked together for the Declaration of Independence. One was the pen that penned it, and the other was the voice that argued for it. So, but they had a falling out. So George Washington was the first president, and back then, the person that got the second most amount of votes would be the vice president. And so that was John Adams for 2 terms. And then when John Adams becomes president, the second most popular person was Thomas Jefferson. And so Jefferson was underneath of Adams, but you had a big government, small government divide. Adams wanted a big central government so he could afford to have a navy and defend himself against the British getting close to the War of 1812 and the French who were capturing American ships, and also wanted a big government so there would be a stable currency. Jefferson wanted a small federal government to prevent a repeat of King George III and him dominating everybody's lives. So Jefferson sort of campaigned during his 4 years as vice president. And so Jefferson got elected the third president. And Adams had expected to serve 2 terms and he only served 1. So John Adams rode out of town on a carriage on the day that Jefferson was being inaugurated. He didn't show up at it. And so they didn't talk for years, but it was Benjamin Rush that helped write letters to one, write letters to the other. Then they began to correspond, and they had several decades of letter writing that has become classics in American revolutionary history. Benjamin Rush was a proponent of public education for women as well as for men. And public education means that it was free because the different denominations had their own schools. So Massachusetts was a Puritan Congregationalist state. And so they had a Congregationalist Puritan school called Harvard. And then Connecticut was Congregationalist. They had a school called Yale. And the Presbyterians had a school called Princeton. And the Baptists had a school called Brown. And so every denomination, and so this was a pioneering work to say, we'll have a school for the poor kids of any denomination, and it would be free. And so Benjamin Rush wrote in 1786, Thoughts upon the Mode of Education Proper in a Republic. And now how am I doing time-wise, Kathy?
Well, yeah, we probably should jump in. Oh, sorry, Kathy.
All right, we'll go ahead and jump in, and then I can take questions and come back to this.
You know, usually our speaker speaks for like 5 minutes, but you were so fascinating. I just kept listening because it was so interesting.
I apologize.
No, I would have stopped you if I thought it wasn't fascinating. And that's a word we like here, fascinating, and it truly was. Everything, and what a patriot Benjamin Rush was. Wow. Even reconnecting Jefferson and Adams to reunite their bitter dispute of years and to reunite them at the end of their lives. He's amazing. And to learn that colleges were free, that Harvard was free, and all those.
No, those weren't, but the public ones were free.
Oh, I thought they were because they were founded on faith, and they believed that they should be free. No, that's not true.
No, they had real strict requirements to get into the Harvard and all the others.
They weren't free. They weren't free.
No, those were paid for, but the public schools they started later.
Right.
They pioneered
all
that.
Right. Well, I'm glad I cleared that up. Okay, so I want to make sure we only have about 20 minutes here, and Tova has to get off to go to class. So I just have 4 things. Well, now 3 that I want to touch on, and then I'll pass it on to Tova, and then to Jewel and Joran and Kathy, and for the audience questions. The blanket. First of all, I think what's so important for all of us to remember when we judge people in the past, which of course that's necessary and deserved at times, but it's so important to remember where their mindset was when or if we make those judgments, because to think that they didn't know what germs were, they also believed that thunder was from God. I guess you can look at that different types of ways if you want to, but they didn't understand the science of thunder. They didn't even know what electricity was, but to think that they didn't understand germs. And there was just an intellectual naivete that they had. And it's really, really interesting when you think about the things that they didn't understand. I want to make a comment about Dorchester Heights. I believe when they were up on the heights, that's in Boston. That's in the Boston area, correct? Dorchester Heights. And the English ships were below, and they finally left because Washington had that great advantage of being high at Dorchester High, but he had no ammunition at that time. He was bluffing. He was bluffing on the bluff.
Yeah, well, they did bring cannons down from Fort Ticonderoga in Canada, and they put those up on the hills, and they did have cannonballs and gunpowder, but he did also take logs and paint them black and had them interspersed in between the cannons. So from the British point of view, it looked like lots and lots of cannons.
Yeah. And I think there was an actual gun ammunition problem at the time. I just remember it when I read his biography, there was some, and Toby, you may remember because we all read it for our book club, but you read it more recently. It seems like there was some.
Well, that definitely was the Battle of Bunker Hill. They ran out of gunpowder.
Well, whatever. Okay. Well, but there was a bluff on the bluff. I just kind of remember that. But talk about the blanket again, giving the blanket to the Indians. I don't know that I really understand that. So someone deliberately gave a blanket to the Indians, the Native Americans, so that they would all catch smallpox. But how would he have known if he gave the blanket if they didn't understand germs? So that was transpired that way. I'm not understanding the blanket situation. Maybe I don't know. I haven't heard of that.
Right. So this wasn't Americans. This was the French had teamed up with the Indians, and they had everything west of the Appalachian Mountains. And the British had a fort called Amherst, and the French and the Indians had surrounded it, and they were killing and wiping out these British forts. And so one British soldier said, why don't we take some of these blankets that were on some of the soldiers that were dying of smallpox and give them to a merchant who could give them to the Indians. That's the only documented occurrence of that being mentioned.
But my question is, they gave them to the merchant so the merchant could make money. What was A, the purpose of giving the blankets, but B, did they even understand that they would be infecting the Indians if they didn't understand?
I think they sort of figured it was
a deliberate attempt to get people, the Native American smallpox. I'm not understanding the correlation.
Right. Even though they didn't understand germs, they somehow thought that the one talked about putting the tip of an arrow into somebody's pox that had it and twanging it at the enemy. So they somehow thought that it spread, but they didn't know how. But the British clearly would release prisoners that were infected with smallpox and let them go amongst the Americans, and it would kill lots of people.
Yeah, so everybody was doing it to everybody. In other words, British, French to British, British to Americans, and but the blanket was from the French. That was a French idea. No,
it was one of the British at the Amherst Fort. But this was during the French and Indian War, which was about 15 years.
Sorry.
The French and Indian War was 15 years before the Revolution.
Right. So who gave the blanket to whom? Was it British?
The British gave them to the French and the Indians. That's the accusation.
Okay, so the British gave them to the French to catch smallpox so that they could annihilate their enemy.
That was the thought mentioned in this person's letter. Yes. So it happened during the French and Indian War. Correct.
And so they didn't just want to give it to the Indians; they wanted to give it to the British. No, the French. The British
Correct.
wanted to give it to the French.
Yes. Yes.
Okay,
right.
I think I got it. Okay,
Right.
The British didn't just want to give it to the Native Americans; they wanted to give it to the French because they wanted to win the war, and it was the concept of war.
Yes.
So they must have understood that germs were on the blanket then.
Yeah, they didn't know about germs. They just knew that somehow or another it would go from one to the other.
Okay.
But it wasn't until Louis
Thank you for
Pasteur.
clearing that up. Okay. Tova, you may have, Jewel and Jordan, y'all may have learned that in your new history classes about the blanket. I didn't know anything about it. I'm sure Kathy doesn't either. I didn't know nothing about the blanket, but it's interesting that it was in the concept of war. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Tova to ask a couple of questions, and then Jewel and Jordan ask a couple of questions. I just will say it's already 2:40, so Tova, Jewel, and Jordan, and Kathy, everybody watch the clock, okay? There you go.
Thanks. This was really, really interesting. And actually, by my school, like a few blocks away, there's a hospital called Rush Hospital. I never knew what it was named after. I just Googled it. It is named after Benjamin Rush. So I passed that twice a day on the way to and from school. So now I will educate my peers about that because it's so fascinating. And I'm proud to have that in my community, named after such a cool person. But I was wondering, could you elaborate more on Rush's like anti-slavery activities? Like, how did he develop anti-slavery views? Did he always have it, or did he develop it later in life? And it must have been hard to be anti-slavery at a time where it was, a big institution. So how did he kind of work against it?
Right. So all the world had slavery. The Jews were enslaved in Egypt. Hammurabi's code talked about slavery. About 40% of Athens was slaves. Julius Caesar captured across Europe and captured Slavic peoples, and the word Slav got the connotation of a permanent servant, so we say slave. And the American Indians enslaved each other. So the Aztecs enslaved the tribes around them. Inca Empire, they were all slaves. And so this is one of the curses of human nature. The anti-slavery movement started in America, particularly with the Quakers. William Penn, nonviolent, and so the Quakers settled Pennsylvania, and there was 1688 was the first petition to end slavery in America. It's called the Germantown Petition, done by Quakers. And so Anthony Benezette is a Quaker around the year 1700 in Philadelphia. And he has a school to teach Black children to read and write. And he writes a book on the evils of the slave trade. And he convinces the Quaker denomination to officially be against slavery. And this book is read by Patrick Henry, who said, I can no longer defend slavery. And so Patrick Henry introduces a bill to end the importation of slaves into Virginia, and it passes. It influenced Jefferson. Jefferson's first draft of the Declaration would have gotten rid of slavery. But South Carolina and Georgia wouldn't go along with it. And since it was the panic of the war, they said, we'll deal with it later. We wish they wouldn't have. So this was the movement. And so Anthony Benezette started in Philadelphia, the very first anti-slavery society. And then Benjamin Rush helped with that. And then Ben Franklin became the president of it. And in 1793, Ben Franklin made a direct request to the US Congress to end slavery. Unfortunately, they didn't do it then. But they did end the importation of slaves in 1807, same year that William Wilberforce did it over in England. So that's when Benjamin Rush would have gotten that influence from the Quakers. And then the Methodists was a revival movement inside of the Anglican Church that later split out on its own. And the Methodists were the next major force to end slavery. And there was a signer of the Constitution, Richard Bassett, and he converted, became a Methodist. He freed all of his slaves and began to pay him as hired labor, and then actually rode on the wagon with them to their church services and went to church with them. So this was a movement. Today we see the statistics show more and more people are becoming pro-life with the advances of science. They're being able to see, no, it really is a unique person. And so we're seeing that was sort of the attitude back then. It was a growing movement to end slavery, and more people were getting on board with it. And about half the country the states had outlawed slavery prior to the Civil War. Unfortunately, the rest of them, it took the war to get rid of slavery permanently.
Thank you. And then how did Rush get involved in politics? From I guess nowadays we tend to think of medicine as pretty separate from politics. So how did he combine the two?
Well, back then, being involved in politics was sort of like jury duty today. You're a person, you get a letter in the mail that says you have to report for jury duty. It's like, oh, great, I'm busy. I got all kinds of stuff to do. A lot of people try to get out of it. That was sort of the attitude back then. A lot of people did not want to get involved. And so it was sort of like, okay, I built my career. I have some extra free time. I'll go ahead and agree to volunteer. And one person said the invention of air conditioning was the worst invention for America, because this allowed the politicians to meet all year round, where before they would only meet for a short time in the summer because Washington, D.C. would get too hot. But Benjamin Rush was just a very well-respected person in Philadelphia. Everybody liked him of all persuasions because as a doctor, he treated them all. And so that's why they recommended that he be a representative to the Continental Congress.
Is that it, Tova?
Sure. For time's sake, I'll pass on.
Okay. Thank you, Tova. All right, Jewel and Jordan. Where'd Jewel go? Good to see Jordan. Oh, there he is. Wow, that's just sort of.
We're out of our green screen today.
Oh, okay. That was just like, wow.
Our friend needed to borrow, so we're popping in and out.
Go ahead.
Man,
you have about 7 minutes. Okay.
Okay. What a great episode so far, and what an interesting gentleman. But in Benjamin Rush's life, you obviously named tons of milestones and so many important aspects of his contributions to America. But I want to know, in your eyes, what from his ideals to his actions, just to his whole person, what do you want me and the viewers to take away as the most important or influential aspect of his life?
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. I would think his faith. And when he wrote a book called Thoughts on the Mode of Education, he says, I proceed to inquire what mode of education we shall adopt so as to secure to the states and the proper instruction of the youth. And he says that the only foundation for education can be laid is in religion. And he says, the religion I mean to recommend is that of the New Testament, the doctrines and its precepts. Why is that? So kings, like the King of England, ruled through fear. It's top down. You do what they say or they kill you. Republics are bottom up. And so if you can sort of picture top down versus bottom up. So a republic is you're depending upon the people. And his idea was that the people need to be educated and they need to be moral if they're going to be the king. So the word citizen is Greek. It means co-king. So America, what our founders did is they basically had a polarity change in the flow of power. Instead of top down, it's bottom up. I tell people it's the difference between a pyramid that's run top down or a living tree with a root system, and every little tiny root participates in sucking in nutrients to make this bottom up thing work. And so his understanding was we need to have an educated moral populace for this experiment of a republic to work. Here's a quote that Benjamin Rush wrote, a plan for free schools, written in 1787. Let the children be carefully instructed in the principles and obligations of the Christian religion. This is the most essential part of education. So it's this idea that science and education tells you how to do something, but morality tells you, should you do something? And if you don't have the morality in there, you could be just educating really smart thieves. So you need the moral guidance to know, what do you do with all this knowledge?
Ah, okay. Thank you.
So Benjamin Rush actually did inoculate individuals. He actually did it himself, or did he oversee?
Yeah, no, he did it to Patrick Henry
Wow.
and others. And yeah, you when you read that, the medical practices back then, it was a little bit gruesome from our point of view, and they didn't have all the painkillers and the antiseptics, and even during the Civil War, they would pour honey in a wound, and the honey, if you'd ever noticed, you can have honey sitting on a shelf and it doesn't spoil. It has a preservative quality to it, and so they would pour honey in there, and then they would have leeches, and it sounds sort of gross, but these were little, type of critters that they would put on there. It would suck the blood out. And so if somebody had an infection that was deep, they would put these leeches and it would suck that infected blood out. Even during the Civil War, they would have these whole barns with all these soldiers that had limbs cut off, and flies would be landing on them and putting larvae in there. And then they would let them do it because the larva would eat the damaged tissue, and then it would eventually heal and drive them out. Again, sort of gruesome from our point of view. But it was Ignaz Semmelweis, a Austrian-Hungarian doctor, that suggested that they wash hands. And it was in America, Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., who was a Christian doctor. And he noticed that doctors would do autopsies in the morning, and then in the afternoon deliver babies. And then they saw this rash of babies and mothers dying, and they would just continue it. And he's like, no, wash your hands in between touching the dead body and touching, and he was ridiculed for it. But finally, with the invention of the microscope, and Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. started the Harvard Medical School, and he introduced the use of the microscope in Harvard Medical School. And they began to see these little bitty things. But then there was a Christian doctor named Joseph Lister, and he found out that if you pour alcohol and so forth, it would kill these little things. And so he came up with Listerine. And
it's amazing. The one thing I want to say, not all the way on topic, but as far as the blanket thing, that's something, Janine, that we heard in school, where they would be talking about the genocide of the Indians, and then someone would say that, well, primarily it's not genocide because they were mostly wiped out by sickness. And then someone would say, well, that's not really true because the sickness was given to them by pilgrims who gave them blankets with smallpox. So it is peddled around. I think I heard that in both my schools, Muhlenberg and Moravian, someone said it, and it was never said that it was untrue. And it's also spoken about as if it was something that happened more than one time. So that's my personal experience with that.
Yeah, they do teach that, and it is especially with Mexico, where you had most of the native population killed through smallpox and other diseases. But for the most part, it was not intentional, and because Europeans died of it as well. It was just that if you look, there's a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel, and Jared Diamond wrote it, anthropologist, and he studied how you call it Eurasia. You'd have wars, and you'd have the Mongols and the Turks, and they would be capturing and conquering and intermarrying, and so there's this mix of genetics through Eurasia, Europe, Asia, and part of Africa, that when a disease came through, a certain percentage of people would survive. Most of the scientists think that the American population crossed the Bering Strait sometime in the distant past, and then there's either a higher water in the Bering Strait sort of became impassable. But the American Indian DNA is very similar to those in Siberia and in Mongolia, but it was isolated. And so when a European disease finally came over to these American Indians, they didn't have that mix of captured battles and getting sleeping with women that they captured. And so the American Indians had a different, more vulnerable DNA, and so as a result, they suffered and massively more. But it's a stretch to say that it was an intentional thing to do it, because there were European-based people that died of the diseases as well.
Yes, and it sounds like it was done during an act of war, really, right?
Yeah, the Amherst one specifically was, yes, it was, British. And it was the French and Indian. The Indians sided with the French against the British. When the French lost, the Indians lost a bunch of territory. The next war is the Revolution. The Indians side with the British against the Americans. The British lose, and so the Indians lose more territory. The Indians side with the British during the War of 1812. When the British lose, the Indians lose more territory. It's sort of like they sort of sided with the wrong. They were being taken advantage of by a global, 1,000-year gripe between the French and the English.
Right. That's why history is so important, to have a concept of the times. All right, Kathy.
Well, thank you, Mr. Federer. One of our listeners has emailed in, would like to know more about the Jefferson-Adams feud. He says that was a great explanation of the history of the feud, but what exactly did Benjamin Rush do to facilitate their reconciliation?
He wrote letters. So he would write a letter to John Adams and sort of soften him up and saying, hey, why don't you let bygones be bygones? And so it was John Adams that actually wrote the letter first to Thomas Jefferson. And somebody actually added up the letters, and there's probably twice as many letters from Adams to Jefferson than Jefferson responding. But Jefferson did respond. They talked about, science. They talked about politics. They talked about religion. And so it was, and then when Abigail Adams dies, Thomas Jefferson writes to John and says, I'm so sorry. And then he says, we'll see her again in heaven when God will wipe away every tear and we'll be reunited with our loved ones. And then they died on the same day. It was July 4th, 1826, 700 miles apart from each other. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams died on the exact same day. The same day.
Same year.
50 years to the day that they approved the Declaration of Independence. I wrote about it. As a matter of fact, I have a website, AmericanMinute.com, and I have postings for every day, and you can do a search on there, but you can pull up that article that I wrote on, I think it's July 5th is when I wrote that.
And when John Adams died, he didn't know Jefferson died on the same day in the same year, and he said, Jefferson lives.
Correct, yeah.
Okay, Kathy, is there another question?
Well, you had also mentioned about Benjamin Rush being the father of psychiatry. I think you had also mentioned that Benjamin Rush was one of the first to recognize alcoholism as a disease. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Right. So they would, again, call somebody a town drunk and lock him up. And his idea was, well, don't just lock him up. Let's examine why he is doing this and analyzing, depression and so forth. And the idea was you help them to overcome it. And he pioneered that. And it was, even today, the American Psychiatric Association acknowledges the contributions of Benjamin Rush. But it was sort of cruel the way that they treated people before. They just lock them up for the rest of their life. They're depressed, they're drinking, they're mentally unstable, just lock them up and forget about them. And his idea was, no, let's help them, let's doctor them.
It's really fascinating. And then Karen Sue Hensley says that was really interesting on the universities being founded on different religions. And Lauren Berg writes, hi from New Jersey. Up to the Civil War, they thought miasma caused infection, which led to ventilation, which of course helped. I didn't know if there was anything that you might want to say about that.
Not specifically, but it was, it's interesting. There were whole orders of nuns that would follow the armies around in Europe. And even Florence Nightingale, the pioneer of nursing, says there's no one that knows better how to take care of the sick than a nun. And so the Catholic nuns would wear a habit, that little hat on their head. That became the nurse's hat, that distinctive hat that nurses would wear. And so during the Civil War, you had Clara Barton, a school teacher. She's following the army around, helping to take care of doctoring up people. And there were orders of nuns. And so even Lincoln specifically asked an order of nuns, Sisters of Charity, to help. And there's a monument to them in Washington, D.C. They also helped during the Spanish-American War, along with Clara Barton. And then she founded the American Red Cross. But it was our medical care today is very short, the history of the development of it. For the longest period, it was just during the Revolution, they called the women camp followers. And that term does not do them justice, because these women were the ones that did take care of the sick.
Well, and speaking of women involved in medical care, Keith Romling writes, John Adams' wife, while living on their farm in Massachusetts, took action to vaccinate herself and her children from smallpox. I believe one of them did get it, but survived. Was her action the result of Dr. Burns' actions? I heard that John Adams refused to be inoculated. Is that true?
I don't know the specifics about that, so I apologize. But I do know that it was not regulated. It was a new science. The word vaccinate comes from vaca, which means cow. And they would take cowpox, and I think it was a Dr. Jenner, and he would use the cowpox and scrape the scabs, and then it turned into the idea of inoculating people against smallpox and other diseases. But it was originally the cowpox, but it was all new. There was another guy, Joseph Priestley, and he's the guy that discovered oxygen, and so this is sort of the latter part of the scientific revolution and into the industrial revolution. But a lot of things we take for granted today, they didn't know anything about.
Okay. Well, Janine, I'll hand it back over to you.
Oh, thanks, Kathy. In closing, first of all, wonderful, Mr. Federer. Really terrific. You're just the fountain of knowledge. If there were ever an epitome or an example of a fountain of knowledge, it would be you. And it's really, really, really terrific. Can you go back and just highlight the 5 or 6 things that the Hebrew religion were doing that then science proved later? I'm really fascinated about that. That's happened with alcoholism too. Things that sort of God told them in the beginning when they were founding AA about cycles and things of that nature of 90 days. And now science has backed up the 90-day situation and all of this, 90 days before you do this and that. The first 90 days are really important in sobriety. Now they actually can figure that out scientifically. And I believe, that comes from an intuition from God that gives people this inspiration. So I would love to hear that. One was the carboning of the water, that they took the ashes from the heifer and poured the water through to carbon the water, and now they know that that actually purifies water. What were the other 4 or 3?
Right. So the Hebrew law, they had a civil law, a ceremonial law, and a dietary law. And the dietary law was the idea that God wanted to keep his chosen people alive, right? And so it had these different things. One of the main ones was sewage treatment. And so specifically right there, when they're in the wilderness, it says when you have to release yourself, go outside of the camp and bring a shovel with you and use the earth and cover it. You see, in Europe, they would just let the sewage just run down the middle of the street. Places in India, I mean, cholera was a disease that came from India. They would bathe in the sewage-filled Ganges River and get this disease of cholera. And it was just local until the British put in railroads and steamboats, and then cholera went and spread across Europe and killed millions of people. And then it came to America in 1849, killed 150,000. It's interesting, the president was Zachary Taylor, and he declared a day of fasting and prayer. And then the death rates finally dropped off. But then they found out that it spread through water. It was a doctor in England, and he marked on a map where all the cholera cases were. It said it's all around this one well. So he took the handle off the well, and the people had to go to other wells to get water, and the cholera went down. So, but it was so the Hebrews, it was the water treatment. It was when somebody had a disease, they would isolate them, and the priest would examine them, and if it healed up fine, but if it was communicable, they would be quarantined for 40 days. And the word for 40 in Latin is quarenta. That's where that word came from. They wouldn't eat pork. You'd eat animals that chewed their cud and had a split hoof, a cloven hoof. And when you look at that, that basically gets rid of the type of animals like pigs that eat garbage. And so you're just eating the ox, or the cow and the chicken and the lamb and so forth. And so these are healthier animals. It was different things that, but there's a book called None of These Diseases, and that documents probably 100 of these small little things called None of These Diseases. It was written years ago, but it highlights that the Hebrew law actually scientifically, provably has verifiable health benefits.
Yeah, that's great. God was whispering in the ear, as he was doing with Benjamin Rush, to bring it back to full circle. He was really inspiring Benjamin Rush to be an out-of-the-box thinker and to have some great intuition into these situations. Which also, in closing, your book, I think, sounds really fascinating about science and God's inspiration in science. So everyone should check that out. Well, tell us, we need to wrap up now, but just tell us the name of that book again, Mr. Federer.
Sure. My book is Miraculous Milestones in Science, Medicine, and Innovation, and the Faith of Those Who Achieve Them. So it's Miraculous Milestones, and my website's AmericanMinute.com. And there one interesting quote. So it's 1788. Benjamin Rush writes to Elias Boudinot, another one of the founding fathers, regarding a parade that took place in Philadelphia. And he says, the rabbi of the Jews locked arms with 2 ministers of the gospel was a most delightful sight. There could not have been a more happy emblem. So he said that. So at the time of the founding of America, about 98% of the country was Protestant, right? 3 million people, about 1% Catholic, right? About 30,000, and 0.1% Jewish. So maybe 3,000. So there's only 7 synagogues in the whole country at the time of the Revolutionary War. Wasn't until a middle 1800s persecution of Jews in Bavaria that they began to increase to about 1% of the pop. And then in 1890s, you have the Russian Tsar persecuting Jews, and then several million came over, and the Jewish population became what it is today, around 2%. But it's interesting. I wrote about all this. in some of my books. But the miraculous milestones in science, medicine, and innovation goes through the Kepler, Copernicus, Galileo, and Benjamin Rush, and people like that.
Galileo. Okay. Well, everyone should run out, walk, and get that. What's the name of that other book? Did anybody write this down? I should have written it down. The one that's older book about the
right. So it's called None of These Diseases.
All right,
and that's a quote from Leviticus where it says, in Deuteronomy, if you serve the Lord, none of the diseases of Egypt will come upon you. But if you forsake the Lord and forsake his law, then the diseases will come and overtake you. But my website's AmericanMinute.com. And again, miraculous milestones is what I primarily talked about today.
Yay. Well, thank you so much. It was a wonderful show.
Awesome show. Thank you so much. That was incredibly interesting.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It's a real honor to be on with you.
All right. Thank you so much. And Kathy.
Well, thank you, Jewel and Jorn and Aubrey and Tova and Janine and Kathy. So thank you.
You got it.
And we want to remind everybody to tune in next week on Tuesday, June 22nd. We're going to be looking at another little known signer, Roger Sherman, with Tom Hand of AmericanaCorner.com. And then the week after that, on June 29th, we'll be looking at George Wythe with author Suzanne Harmon Munson. So we invite everyone to join us.
And after that, Anti-Federalist. We're going to have a great 3-month study on the Anti-Federalist. It's going to be really interesting. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
All right. God bless.
Bye. God bless.
Bye-bye.